Okay, all right, Commissioner, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Looking to see if we had anyone in the attendees section. So we have one attendee so far. So just good to be sort of conscious of who's out there, and just letting Barb Atwell, just letting you know that the chat function is enabled, so we will be able to view your chat as we move through our agenda today, and we can go ahead and get started. Looks like we have a sort of rough outline of an agenda. A lot of what we had talked about in our previous planning meeting was around how just sort of structure and how to approach this. And so I guess really quickly for since we have a couple new additions on the panel and we have an attendee in the webinar, maybe if everybody can just quickly go around and introduce themselves. I'll just start from how you guys look on my view here. So Lieutenant Turner.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, good evening, everyone. I am Joe Turner. I'm a police lieutenant here with the Oakland Police Department. I've been with the department for about almost 15 years, and I currently work in the Policy and Publication Unit here with the Bureau of Services. So good to see everyone.
Thank you. Deputy Chief Allison.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Assistant Chief Darren Allison. The police department, been with the department for about 27 years. Serve as the number 2 in the organization. I report directly to Chief Armstrong, and definitely happy to be here as we develop some of the key policies that are governed by the military equipment ordinance and law.
Thank you. Erickson Amaya.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Erickson Amaya, but all my students refer me as E. I currently work with 67 Sueños and been working with Oakland high schools for 8 years now. And I'm the current lead of organizing and for 67 Sueños. And yeah, that's me. And thank you for having me.
Thank you. John Lindsay Poland.
Good evening, everyone. Good to see you. My name is John Lindsay Poland. I work for the American Friends Service Committee, participated in the ad hoc committee on armored vehicles last year, and have been working with communities around the implementation of AB 481 around the state.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't have ranks for the other 2 officers here, so if I'm a little less formal with you guys, Jeffrey Thomason.
Hello, my name's Lieutenant Jeffrey Thomason. I've been with the police department for over 23 years. I oversee the Special Operations Division, which is part of the Support Operations section, and I oversee the Special Events section, Mental Health, Homeless Unit, Helicopter, SWAT, K9, ABAT, and the Cannabis Officer. So a lot of things we're going to be talking here tonight are under my direction.
Thank you. And finally, Omar Dasa.
Yes, I'm a lieutenant for Oakland PD. Been on, it's going to be my 16th year, kind of like D. Everyone calls me DQ here. I'm the Special Resource Commander for BFO-1 Community Resource Officers, and currently just assisting as the acting captain for Area 3, which is the Lake Merritt area. I started the drone program. We just went live a couple months ago, so I'm the subject matter expert and commander for the Electronic Services Unit, which is the robotics team, and our drone unmanned aerial vehicle unit.
Great, thank you. So as was discussed earlier, it seemed like the place to begin here, well, sort of 2 things. first thing is that we wanted to discuss sort of transparency in how we are sort of engaging with community around this, as well as sort of what our intentions were around how we sort of capture community voice, as well as make sure that this process remains transparent by both airing these live as well as having them recorded on the website. There was a question of when there may be confidentiality or necessary for certain aspects of these equipment and policies or use policies and or training bulletins related to these equipments. And that was sort of determined that we would approach that as on an as needed basis. Oh, I see Commissioner Shea has joined us. So hello, Commissioner Shea. I guess I would like to hear from Mr. Lindsay Poland and Mr. Amaya about their sort of perspectives on that aspect of this ad hoc before we move forward onto the overarching policy, which is sort of our first step in this ad hoc, as so we've determined in our previous meeting. Either of you can just jump in.
Well, I appreciate that these meetings are open to the public. I did ask a question before this meeting about whether there would be any opportunities for public comment. I do understand that this ad hoc is not Brown acted. The staff, the commission staff responded that the public could make comments in the chat function. I do think that at some point it might be worthwhile over the next few months to have an organized community public meeting where there's some real outreach done for participation. I think these are very complex issues. As we've seen, there's a lot of documents, a lot of technical terms, and so getting ready for that probably does also mean figuring out ways to present it and share it and ask questions in ways that are not, don't kind of put up a sheen or a wall because of the technicality and the extensive, how many documents are involved. Those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, but if it's okay for me to jump in, definitely transparency is key, right, to building relationships within community. I work in schools, and a lot of times information is not accessed, and unfortunately for families and the students that are being served, they are often the last ones that get the news or are able to understand or even engage with the content at hand. So definitely for me, like, how can we invite all types of different communities, especially with growing ones that we're seeing in our own high schools, but again, like, I think part of it is engaging with folks. We use a lot of systems that send out information, so even utilizing those systems to our to advancing more like community engagement, that would be key, so definitely I come from that perspective, and definitely want to have more community input, right? Because at the end of the day, that's who we're serving. And yeah, thank you.
So I will just quickly respond to a couple of things there, and I'll give Commissioner Shea also an opportunity to respond. Commissioner Shea and I are both also on the outreach committee, and so reasonably we are both pretty invested in making sure that we do get community perspectives on all of these policies. It is our intention that all ad hocs, especially the policy ad hocs, have a fairly sort of robust and significant amount of community input. To that end, that unless there is some legal reason why we cannot have a community forum and cannot have these meetings held publicly, they kind of all will be, and the conversation will be sort of available to anyone who is interested. That said, interested is not always, or interested in and aware is not necessarily the people who are proactively interested and already aware are not the only people who maybe whose voices we should hear in this forum. And so I agree that we should think about, we should start thinking about now how we want to approach that when we want to hold a community forum around the policies we're working on. In some ad hocs, we've done them early on in the process to try and inform the language and direction we're working towards. In others, we've held it towards the end as a sort of review of the work we've completed. As members of the ad hoc itself, you have your perspective is desired in when that is scheduled, and what it looks like and how we go about recruitment for those forums. I don't know, Jesse, if you have anything.
I don't think we're sure. I don't think we're limited to one particular forum, especially because we don't have all of the policies, and sometimes these policies can fairly be grouped into different areas, right? So for instance, we have some crowd control things. I think that's could be a grouping mechanism for one set of policies. We have something that's a little bit more broader, so such as the we have Special Order 9196, if we're touching that, documenting use of force. That's more of a larger general policy that perhaps we could group with the militarized use equipment one that we're going to be starting off with. It may not be one, because if you just try to do one big amorphous one, then, well, you're going to get all sorts of things and maybe not particularized input that we're looking for. I do very much think that community input is going to be a big part of this. It may not be the portion that specifically gets these policies in line with state and local law as to why we're all here, but it's something that, as long as we're getting through these, we might as well update whatever policies we can.
Thanks. So I mean, speaking of getting in line with state and local law, we should also acknowledge that we are on a timeline, and that we have to be super cognizant of what that looks like, and how all of our work fits into that that structure. So to that end, I'd suggest, unless anyone has any other thoughts about how we should move forward, I guess maybe I'd hand it over for the time being to Chief Allison, or maybe Lieutenant Turner, to sort of start the conversation around that initial overarching policy, unless I'm missing another obvious place to begin.
No, Commissioner Jordan, I think that would probably be a good starting point. So if you like, what we can do is, I don't know, Joe, if you or Jeff are going to actually walk through K7, but if you'd like, we can just walk through K7 as a policy and at least get our feet wet into what the overarching policy looks like. Joe, is Jeff?
Yeah, I can do it. I know everyone here has the draft policy for K7. I can share it and put it up on it, or I do have a PowerPoint for K7. We can do that, but I think probably the policy is better. I'll leave it up to you guys.
Let's go with the policy. Might as well just get right down to it.
Okay.
Appreciate your work on developing a PowerPoint for it, though.
But I'll still use the PowerPoint for me. So just give me a second here to share my screen. So you guys can see it? Okay. All right, this is a K7. This is the military equipment funding, acquisition, and use policy. I'm going to start going over the overview. Is on September 30th, 21, Governor Gavin Newsom, he signed Bill AB 481 into law, which established protocols for law enforcement regarding funding, acquisition, use, and reporting of military equipment. This bill added Government Code 770 to law. Also, previously, the Oakland City Council passed OMC 9.65, which basically mirrors this policy and mirrors the government code. On May 29 or May 19th, the Oakland Police Department published their inventory lists on the website, and also a draft policy of case 7, which is this one. So the commander's intent is the first section, and if you guys just want, we'll just look at each section, and if people have comments on it or concerns or anything, we can go over it. So the commander's intent is just basically providing the rules for approval, acquisition, use, and reporting requirements for military equipment. And that's outlined in Government Code 770 and the OMC section. Oh, that was easy. Good, we got the first one done. Just keep on going down, or? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty small group. I think that, and we can probably keep it moderately casual, as long as people sort of.
I mean, people can cut me off. This is my first ad hoc, so I didn't know how the format was going to go or anything. So
if folks have comments or would like to pause and have a bit of a conversation about meaning or phrasing or any of that, let's jump into it. Otherwise, maybe you can just consider to keep rolling on.
Okay. So next section, the first section, which is A, is policy, is the policy section. So it goes over basically how we're going to do the public's welfare, safety, civil rights, civil liberties, take all that into account. It's just the overall summary, taking into account the government code and the OMC code. Here we're going to get down to definitions, which is, it goes over the definitions of this policy, which is the Government Code 770. That's the first part of this, and it goes into page 1 and 2 of our policy. And then also I added in a section, which is the OMC 9.65, which I'll get into it right after this. So the first definition is governing body. And basically it's just saying that the governing body, and the OMC code kind of goes into this, how it pretty much says that the Oakland City Council and the Oakland Police Commission are the governing bodies for this. Law enforcement agency, that's going to be the police department.
Could I just say something about governing body? The state law, unlike the local ordinance, only names the governing body as the city council. So obviously the city can require a review before it determines, takes its action. But under the state law, the police commission doesn't count as the governing body. Only the city council does, unlike the local ordinance.
Yeah, the state one seems to say that it's the elected body that oversees a law enforcement agency, and police commissioners are not so much elected as appointed.
I think because I think the OMC goes into saying that everything has to go through you guys prior to going to the council.
Oh, absolutely. So I think though that in this particular policy, yes, it should, when you make the reference to governing body, that is likely that's going to be through the commission. But I think, well, we'll see how often governing body gets used in the policy.
There's also in the state law, there's a requirement to name an independent oversight entity. So that matches, that tracks neatly with the local ordinance's requirement that it go through the police commission.
So do you guys want me to change something or add something?
I would say just I would say just flag this particular section and the term governing body,
Okay.
and we figure out how that works out later on. It's just something to note for now.
And maybe I need to add in the OMC, like, hey, the Oakland Municipal Code says that the Oakland Police Department has to go through the police commission for policy review and stuff.
Yeah, it might, you know, under definitions, we may, I guess, as we read through and determine how often this this comes up, the phrase governing body comes up, and to John Lindsay Poland's point, how often sort of independent oversight body comes up, it may be that under definitions we just add independent oversight body as the police commission as a secondary definition, so as to sort of not muddy the waters around that. But and we can flag that here as just sort of a let's get back to it when we see if it becomes problematic in the language of the actual policy. But it seems like that might be a useful sort of bit of clarification.
Okay. Law enforcement agency, any issues, concerns?
No, tracks the government code.
Okay. And then we're coming down to the military equipment. So this is kind of a large section here. So this first part is it's defining the military equipment as it pertains to the government code 770. And it's basically a cut and paste of that. The first one's going to be the unmanned remotely piloted aerial and ground vehicles. That's going to be the drones. Number 2 is going to be the Bearcat stuff, the armored vehicles. Number 3 is going to be something that the Oakland Police Department does not have. It's the Humvees or 2.5-ton trucks. So we don't have those. Number 4, tracked armored vehicles. OPD doesn't have any of those. Number 5 is going to be our command posts, the command post vehicles. We do have 3 of them at the moment right now. I know we're trying to decommission one of them. Number 6 is going to be weaponized aircraft. OPD does not have any of those. Number 7 is going to be battering ram slugs, breaching materials. And we do have stuff like that. Number 8 is going to be firearms of 50 caliber or greater. And we don't have any of those. Number 10, that's number 9. Number 10 is going to be specialized firearms ammunition less than 50 caliber. We do have equipment. Number 11 is going to be inner firearm or accessory that's designed to launch explosive projectiles. We don't have any of those. Number 12 is flashbangs. We do. Number 13 is going to be the LRAD, and we do have those. Number 14 is going to be the bean bags, rubber bullets, SIMs, and we do have some. And number 15 is going to be, it's a catch-all, any equipment that the governing body requires additional oversight. And that's going to be coming into the OMC code 9.65, which they added crowd control equipment such as riot batons, riot helmets, and riot shields.
Could we scroll back up to, there were a couple of them. So first, under number 12, under flashbang, flashbang, but also tear gas, pepper balls, which are, not necessarily the same thing. Similarly, under number 13, I mean, these are sort of the shockwave and microwave weapons, those are sort of area denial devices, as I understand it. And so it might be helpful to sort of categorize those, because those are all sort of distinct items. It might be helpful to categorize them under sort of the controlled usage. At least to my memory of the conversation around the LRAD, it was sort of prohibited as an area denial device, but not as a communication device. And so as it exists here, in this context, it would be helpful to sort of categorize it as that. To my mind, at least.
I understand what you're saying. I think we could during the policy phase, because we're going to have to develop a policy for the LRAD. And I think that's where we dial into what the use would be for it and what's prohibited for under that policy.
Sure. That's fine. I think if we're going to be listing these as sort of under definitions, it would be more helpful to further define them as the category that they sort of exist under. I mean, I am not the sole voice here. I'm not the dictator of this ad hoc. That's just my perspective. We can sort of come back to it, but I do think that it would be helpful, given that there's a sort of spectrum of devices there that have a variety of uses. Specifically, the LRAD has more than one use, and not all those uses are necessarily considered problematic, to my knowledge. Although maybe I'm wrong about that.
So this feels like it's just a I mean, this actually, you said it. This is just a copy and paste from the government code, right? So to the extent that we have any particular device or controlled equipment that may be subject to multiple uses, and we need to further define those uses, I think what's being stated is that that's going to go into the more specific policy. I think getting into like categorization of some of these I think we may struggle a lot just trying to like get categories for all of these when they could all just be under the catch-all, which is number 15, which is any other equipment as determined by a governing body or state agency to require oversight. Are you trying to capture like more other types of equipment that may be area denial type things, or are you just trying to like clarify, hey, this could be used in multiple ways?
I guess I'm trying to capture the fact that up into those two bullet points, all the bullet points were sort of specific and individualized items, if memory serves. But these two kind of are a sort of grouping of distinct items that belong to a category. And it feels like if we're going to be putting in sort of groupings under a bullet point, it would be helpful to sort of at least acknowledge that they're there grouped as a category, for clarity. But we can come back to this. I'm just noting that it does feel like those two bullet points are sort of stand out to me as being slightly different from the others, and it might be helpful to acknowledge why that is. That's all.
So I'd suggest that maybe we, since we are controlled by the OMC, that we just use the OMC definition for those, which both of those, it provides that sort of overarching thing. So it's number 11, the OMC, but it corresponds to 12. It says explosives and pyrotechnics, such as the flashbang grenades, etc. And then number 13 in the OMC, which corresponds with 13 here in the government code, says active area denial weapons. such as the taser, shockwave, microwave weapons, water cannons, etc. The government code does not differentiate out what the OMC says about only the use of the LRAD as an area denial tool triggers the reporting requirements. So we would be bound by the government code, but considering that we're always bound by the strictest definition of the law, I think that we could probably use those OMC sections there.
I'm comfortable with that. And my intention wasn't to sort of isolate the sort of multiple uses of the LRAD as sort of making it less sort of included here. Looks like Chief Allison and John Lindsay Pullen both have their hands up.
Yeah,
So
thank
maybe-
you,
yeah.
Commissioner Jordan. I was just to Lieutenant Turner's point, I thought that was a good suggestion. I would just say that we would definitely need to reference it, since this is almost a quote out of the government code. If we're going to modify, just somehow either footnote that this is a hybrid of it, or have a section that goes a little bit further into the OMC descriptors, because I think we took out the redundant pieces that were even a little bit nuanced, different in language from the OMC, and only put in the OMC section information that was separate or unique from the government code. So we'd either have to footnote it or restate the OMC portion in another kind of definitional piece of it. But I think that it makes sense to me to try and bring in the more restrictive language of whether it's the OMC or the government code into the definition piece of it.
So from my perspective, here it is actually the state law that is more restrictive, in the sense that it requires a use policy for LRADs, whether they are being used as area denial weapons or not. It doesn't, but state law doesn't say only if the LRAD is being used as an area denial weapon or crowd control or whatever. It just says you need a use policy for an LRAD. So from my perspective, that should be the governing, or at least it should determine the extent of the policy that's going to be written, even if there's a separate note that says under the OMC, you know, this is only when it's being used as an area denial weapon. That would be my perspective on this.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And I'm sorry if I muddied the waters by suggesting that there was that we should sort of just parse the LRAD thing at all. That was not my intention. I was just noting that the specific use in the OMC was around an aerial denial device. My only concern here was that, as Lieutenant Turner stated, is that maybe we just use the sort of categorization language to help clarify what exactly we're talking about in these two bullet points. That's all.
So here's what I will suggest, because I kind of see that both, yes, the state law is more restrictive with respect to the LRAD, but the OMC seems to cover more with the definitions, because it kind of has a larger swath, not just the specific things that are mentioned, but such, for instance, the flashbang grenade section, it says explosives and pyrotechnics such as flashbang. So there are other explosives. I mean, there may not be right now, but there could be in the future. That would fall under this particular section. So I do think that with respect to the flashbang definition, we need to incorporate number 11 from the OMC sections and say explosives and pyrotechnics, including but not limited to flashbang grenades, explosive breaching tools, and chemical weapons, but excluding standard issue pepper spray. For 13, we may need an additional section, keep 13 the way that it is, but then also have a separate section that says other active aerial area denial weapons, to make sure that we marry the two correctly. Everyone catch all that?
Yeah, I'm writing it down right now.
And it may, again, not be a perfect copy and paste from the government code, but we want to make sure that we just have one list that is easy to work with. Drop as many footnotes as you need to explain what it is, but we need people to, when the department's considering whether or not to take on, purchase, whatever it may be, or propose some additional equipment, what we need to know whether or not it falls under this policy or not. And so marrying them as much as possible and putting as many things in as possible is probably the way to go. While we're on the subject of marrying the two definitions, are there any other places where the two, both the state law and the local law, may differ, and how are you dealing with that? I see you're highlighting the page there.
So as we get down to right here, the equipment, military equipment, this is the one where I thought it was different than the OMC, and I just, separate it into this paragraph. And it basically talks about how the city council added those different items, and that's riot batons, riot helmets, riot shields. I could add it, if we wanted to keep it separate, I could add their definitions down here under the OMC, or I can just merge it and say at the top that it's both the OMC and the government code, and then just merge it into all one.
I think I'll leave it up to what y'all in the department may think makes the most sense. I see Lieutenant Turner has her hand up. I think I would prefer one list, and just for each paragraph you cite where it comes from, but Lieutenant Turner may have a better idea.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think probably one list to keep it consistent. I did actually, while we were on this topic, I had a question, and Mr. Lindsay Paul, I know you're here, and you're integral in both of these. Both the original Oakland Municipal Code, which originally came from Mr. Commissioner Gage, and then this state law. And I'm wondering, as you had the chance to sort of work through the state legislative process and see some of the other, I know obviously state law is going to get a lot more input and public and otherwise than necessarily an Oakland Municipal Code might have. And I'm wondering if there were changes or anything, or any sort of insight that you might have had, or things where you might say now, looking back on it, we might want to change the Oakland Municipal Code. Anything that your insight in having gone through both of those processes, since we're here at the definition section.
Well, thank you for asking that. I think it's a little early to say. When the Oakland ordinance was passed, we didn't know the state law was gonna be enacted, nor what it would look like. So the state law came after the local ordinance. I think one of the challenges is actually more in the process. The two overlapping processes, which we haven't gotten to yet here, including the calendars that are required for review and approval. And we're about to get to how the state defines a use policy, which is, in the local ordinance, you've got the impact report and the use policy, whereas in the state law, it's one thing. It's a use policy, which doesn't have as many pieces. And I think it is a little bit early to sort of say, oh yeah, if we were doing this again, we would take out this or add that or whatever. But I do think that having the two will be the process part of it could be fairly challenging. But I think it's a good start here.
Thanks.
Okay. I'll get back to it unless there's any other comments or questions. So I'm down to, I think, hopefully I touched on this already, the OMC 9.65, where it did add the batons, helmets, and shields. The department doesn't, we do have the riot helmets, which every officer has one. We do have shields, which are in storage. And then that's about it. So moving on to the next section, unless there's questions about the definition or that top part, the military equipment, I'm going to go to controlled equipment impact report. And that's it means that it's a publicly released written document that includes the minimum of the following. And then it has a description, purpose, impact, mitigation, alternatives, location, third party, and track record. Any concerns or comments?
So here's where the state law does have one additional thing that the local one doesn't, which is a compliance piece that specifically names. This is a component of use policy, is a compliance section, which requires identifying an independent entity that will provide oversight. So whereas in the local ordinance, that's not in the use policy or impact report part, that is part of the use policy required by AB 41. So again, like where we have, you know, like in the previous one, if you, I don't know whether about combining these lists, but it might be helpful to sort of say for each paragraph, you know, whether it's in both in the local and the state law or only in one, and make sure that all of them are there.
Sorry, I'm confused. What does that mean? Like, at what point, this is a definition of what this impact report would be in, and I thought it corresponded with Government Code 7072 and the annual military equipment report that went in. Is that not the case, or what section are you looking at?
I believe this is in the OMC section 9.65. This controlled impact or equipment impact report definitions.
Oh no, sorry, I should have specified who that question was to. That was to Mr. Lindsay Poland. What section are you referring to, Mr. Lindsay Poland, about the authority that?
So the in the state law, this would be in 7070 D, which has all the 7 different components of a use policy. And number 6 under D is the mechanisms to ensure compliance with the military equipment use policy, including which independent persons or entities have oversight authority, and if applicable, what legally enforceable sanctions are put in place for violations of the policy. So that's not in OMC 965. That is not in the impact statement and use policy part. And here in 965, impact report actually serves as part of a use policy, right? It's not just reporting on something that happened. It's defining some things about like purpose and cost and impact, rather than just reporting on what happened, which is how the state law is more structured. Is the state law has a use policy that has a bunch of components, and then there's an annually, beginning a year after it's first implemented, is a report. So the language is a little confusing between the two.
What's the best way to, I'm going to keep using that term, marry the two, if it needs to be?
I kind of think that if the origin in OMC or in AB 481 is cited for each section, at least for like where what you have highlighted there, Lieutenant, the controlled equipment impact report, if at the end of, like somewhere in there, it says OMC's 965, and then at the end you had another section that says AB 41 requires as a use policy or code 7070, use policy includes 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is above, plus number 6, as long as like we said earlier, as long as everything from each, the local and the state, are captured, then I think there's different ways of actually noting that.
Sorry, does it, I mean, John, it feels like, not feels like, I'm sure that you have done a significant amount of sort of comparison between these two pieces of legislation, and probably are, in some ways the authority we have here on a lot of the thinking around how the wording was developed and the intent. It does feel like we have some things that have the same intent, but are the verbiage is slightly different, or the sort of the title for the item is different. So we're going to have to use Commissioner Shea's word, marry those two things and sort of express explicitly that this thing is roughly analogous to this other thing in the other piece, because we're looking to not create two separate policies that speak to the two separate legislative the pieces of legislation. We're looking to create one policy that serves both masters. So yeah, we are going to have to at some point say this serves this this piece of that state law. It overlaps with the local ordinance in this way. But so I think it will serve us in the long run to be explicit around which piece of legislation we are in fact speaking of when we talk, because it does feel like the verbiage is slightly different. And I mean, in the case of the local ordinance, I think it was so I mean, because I worked on that as well. I think it was so explicitly understood that the commission was the sort of body that this was coming back to for oversight, that it didn't feel like it was necessary to name an oversight body in that process. Maybe it was just my being myopic in the moment, because it felt like it was self-evident. But clearly we need to be explicit about that as regards to the state law.
The commission's role is. So it's also the way they're organized a little bit differently, but I agree with you, Commissioner Jordan.
Okay, moving over to controlled equipment use policy definition. Means publicly released, legally enforceable written document governing the use controlled equipment by the Oakland Police Department that addresses at a minimum of the following. And that's purpose, authorized use, prohibited uses, training, auditing, oversight, and transparency. Annual controlled equipment report means a publicly released written document that includes a minimum of the following, which is the description, number 1, summary, how it was used, number 2, a breakdown where the controlled equipment was used, 4, summary of complaints or concerns received, and then number 5, results of internal audits, number 6, estimate annual cost, number 7, impact, 8 is mitigations, and then alternatives is number 9. Go back to the top.
So as sort of in reference to the previous bit of conversation. So this bit here around annual control equipment report, this is the state legislation. Or this is the local, because sometimes I'm getting, okay, this is the local.
Local.
So, yeah, okay. Got it. Happy to move on.
Section C is the military equipment coordinator. So the chief shall designate the special operations section commander as the equipment coordinator responsible. That would be me. And that's then we got the duties down below. Acting as a liaison, identifying the equipment, inventory, collaborating with the allied agencies, and preparing and scheduling and coordinating the annual community engagement meetings, and then preparing for the annual report. We can change anything in that if you guys want. We can change this person right here.
Are you looking to shovel off some
Negative.
responsibilities?
Good
I'm
luck.
just trying to say a joke after 5 pages. That's all.
Nope.
Good luck.
Thank you, Lieutenant Thompson, for your suggestion.
Yeah,
Just make sure you put it's not me, and then
Yeah.
everything else is fine.
yeah. I think Joe would be great at it.
No, no.
DQ does a lot too. DQ would be great.
So a question for you is, in preparing the annual report, are you expecting to issue a single annual report for all of the equipment that falls underneath this policy, or many different reports for each individual piece of equipment?
Just thinking about it right now, it'd probably be one report covering everything.
Yeah, I anticipate that would be our strategy, Commissioner, mainly, to, like Lieutenant Thomason said, we all kind of have a lot of different jobs. We're anticipating will be something similar like this, and like something like what you've seen already on the website. So a gathering of things that is going to be very clear about where each item that they're reporting on falls within the structure. So that's why we have these clear definitions of what the controlled equipment is, and then so it'll be under item 1, unmanned remotely piloted powered aerial ground vehicles. Then you'd see the reports on that. So to avoid duplicative work, save staff time, things like that, that is what I anticipate that we would do. And then the ability to talk about certain things will be, of course, at your pleasure.
I do have a question about this. When we worked on the armored vehicle policy, I thought one of the most important pieces of that was a description of the procedures for documentation. And some of that was public facing, but some of it was internal. Who gives what information to whom. And I do think that doing this report at the end of the year will be a lot easier if there's clarity at the beginning of the year of how use is going to be documented, so that at the end of the year, you're not trying to reconstruct a gazillion things that had no procedures articulated for them. I mean, I suppose a lot of that could be done with each specific type of equipment. Maybe I know the patrol rifle, for example, already has some stuff in its policy, and the armored vehicle does too. And so maybe there are things that are unique to each type of equipment that are going to determine how those things are documented and reported. But I think it might be useful to have something here that says how that works and who's responsible.
I totally agree. And that was pointed out this last week, and I did add it to page 10. There is a reporting section, which is shown right now. And we can dig into what needs to be reported, or not what needs to be reported. We know what needs to be reported, but how and what information needs to be captured. So. So done with the military coordinator. And then, so approval for funding, acquisition, and use. So this goes into so this is basically mirrors the OMC section that was placed in here. And this is going over the restrictions or how the Oakland Police Department is going to, get equipment. And who's authorized designee shall submit the Oakland Police Commission. I have Oakland Police Commission in here. The controlled equipment impact report and controlled equipment use policy prior to engaging in the following. And it just has restrictions. No. Going to move on. Right below that, it does have a couple of paragraphs. It does go into the police department shall not accept funding or acquire any controlled equipment without review and recommendation by the police commission and approval by the city council. And then also it should not, the police department shall not seek or apply for state, federal, or private funds, donations for the controlled equipment without first review and approval from the police commission.
I'm sorry, Lieutenant, could we go back to the prior list? I wanted to compare with AB 41 again, and I'm looking at the point number 4, collaborating with another law enforcement agency.
Mm-hmm.
It's, as Commissioner Jordan said, it's similar, but not exactly the same. So this suggests that OPD has command. It says such as, but it kind of suggests that OPD has command. And in the state law, it just says collaborating with another law enforcement agency in the deployment or other use of military equipment within the territorial jurisdiction of the governing body. So that seems to me, I'm not entirely sure, like if the sheriff comes in and they're the incident commanders, would that be captured in this? Or, because I think that would be captured under the state law situation, but I'm not sure if it's captured in this.
I think that would be captured in our mutual aid policy if they come in. You're talking about specifically using military equipment in our city?
Yes.
Yeah, so for instance, like, let's say CHP comes in as they have previously and uses a piece of equipment that falls under this category, but they also say, hey, it's the highway, it's our jurisdiction. Are you commanding, controlling, or directing that agency or its personnel in that situation? I think the state law is more restrictive in that it covers more situations, I guess.
Okay.
I think that's going to be, trying to figure out how that actually looks. But I think in mutual aid, certainly we're asking for agencies to come in, and events where we're not asking for mutual aid, but we're asking for assistance. And I can see in the term of, a tactical operation where maybe we have to serve SWAT team search warrants on 2 locations, but we can only resource one of them. So we might have to use another agency. Certainly we would need to report out on that. But there are instances where an agency, an outside jurisdiction, might be doing an investigation in Oakland pertaining to their city that's not ours. We're not asking them to come in, they're following it up. Certainly they require by state law to, report and do their own work, but I don't know if we would have the ability to report out on them if we are not asking them to come in and it's not in regards to one of our investigations. I think they would have the responsibility to do it, but I don't know if, I think, in my mind's eye, this is, we're either asking for help, brings an agency in for help, or they're helping us with the service of the search warrant or tactical situation.
Yeah, I would agree. Sorry, Commissioner, but I would agree with the chief there, because it does, the state law does say that it's collaborating with another law enforcement agency in the deployment or other use of military equipment. So really is, I think, intended to be around those things that he mentions, like when we are calling for them to assist, or when we are, asking them to respond with the expectation that they will bring this sort of equipment. I don't think it's intended to cover sort of every instance where another law enforcement agency, especially in overlapping jurisdictions, might be within the city of Oakland and then ask for some sort of, assistance like traffic control or something like that, where, as the line level officer or even the watch commander that day, that we're expected to have some sort of oversight or command over them and their decisions that we may not have any idea about.
I would think that the key word here is collaborating, right? And so when CHP came in and killed somebody, they were acting unilaterally, right? So they and sometimes CHP, they have the authority to act unilaterally because of the overlapping jurisdictions. But if there's collaboration, it would seem to me that at least in the state law, that it pertains.
I think that's a perspective, but I think that that's a little bit too restrictive, the focusing on collaboration, because I think that basically turns it into a little bit of a suicide pact, where if there's any sort of marrying up of our agencies, which is going to happen, that, then we are, the Oakland Police Department and other agencies, the state law, would be sort of required to be held to, whatever it is that this other law enforcement agency. So I really do think that, the clause in the deployment or other use of military equipment is really the operative one in that section.
So maybe we're just interpreting, I think, if as long as the state language is in there, is referenced, then, let the lawyers decide, right? But the state language, I think, should be referenced here.
Yeah, agreed.
Any issues with these two paragraphs or questions?
Can you go up again? Not with the two paragraphs, sorry. So looking at the second point, it says here that there's a slight difference between state and local. The state one says seeking funds for military equipment. And the local ordinance says accepting. I think you just need to add the word seeking.
Okay.
That's all I got.
Okay. And I think it says tier 2 in this second paragraph. Shall not seek or apply. But we can definitely add it up here. Okay, moving on. A submission to the police commission would seek and review recommendation of the police commission. The police department shall submit the police commission controlled equipment impact report and controlled equipment use policy. Also, these policies shall be made public on the department's website for as long as the controlled equipment is proposed or approved for use. And the police commission shall consider the equipment, controlled equipment impact report and the use policies as agenda items and notice for meetings.
I'm sorry if this is somewhere else, but doesn't the ordinance have a timeline for that process too? For how many days the commission has, that kind of thing, and how many?
It does, but since this is a policy for the police department, it doesn't. Well, Are you gonna have internal procedures as to who's keeping an eye on how many days? And what action to take once those days have passed? Members,
Like you meaning like how many days, like when we submit or the report to you guys?
so one of the things, yeah, so one of the things that's in here is, what is it? Failure by the police commission to submit its recommendation on a proposal within 120 days of the police department submission shall enable city staff to proceed to the city council for approval of the proposal. Are you gonna have some sort of internal process to keep track of that, or to submit it to city council, or just going to let the ordinance take care of that?
I think we will let the ordinance take care of that. Typically, it is on a case-by-case basis, right? Depending on whether it's important and, you know, all kinds of other things. It's just like anything else. Yes, the rule is the rule, but, you know, we're typically not setting precedent here, but typically going to say, hey, we're kind of close. Could you know, move along or whatever, if it gets to that point, which I doubt it will.
Yeah, and that's why we don't have the 120 days listed in here. Yeah.
Yes.
Got it.
That is the law. Yeah.
Okay, moving on, annual reports and use of controlled equipment. So the police department shall submit an annual report to the police commission no later than March 15th. So guidelines in there. That is the OMC section. Or actually, yeah, that's part, yeah, it's part of the OMC section and also the government code 77072. Number one, we might want to talk about, so in the event of an emergency, the Oakland Police Department may acquire additional stock or approval for military equipment without the board approval only if the chief determines that doing so is a response to an emergency.
Who's the board?
That'd probably be the police commission.
Right.
Or
I think that one is the governing body. I think that is governing body there. So we do, at least with the state law, that one's going to be the
council.
So under state law, that is bypassing, there's no mention of a independent oversight body specifically within that loop of under emergency circumstances, correct?
That's right, as far as I can see, there's no mention of that in that part of the state law.
Right. So one thing that some departments have done is, like, because the impact statement or use policy has a quantity, then, and you know, for consumable things, if you go below that quantity, a lot of departments basically say, look, you approved this quantity, we can restock up to that amount, but not beyond that amount, right? So having something here that says something like this, but within the approved amount, not just the type of equipment, but the approved amount, probably would be important.
Is there an emergency section in either the local code or the state law? I don't see it.
No.
I believe the government code has it. Here, let me look. I think John would know, would he?
I think he said
No,
no.
I
No.
don't think either one has
Okay.
that. That's that's y'all's creation.
All right, y'all, what are you trying to do here?
Well, you got to cover some things that might be an emergency to where we have to.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but maybe this might have been in other agencies' overarching use policy, recognizing very similarly to what we see with our privacy ordinance, with some of our privacy governed equipment is, certainly some of the processes to get approval can be rather long. And if we have an emergency situation, and the UAVs are a prime example. Before we had a UAV program, if we were looking for an individual, whether it's missing persons or whatever, we would bring in an agency to have that piece of equipment and we utilize it, but then we would be required to report out on that use because there was an exigency within a certain time frame. So what I would suggest for this section to try and be, above board process, but also understanding that, emergencies do happen, is that that in the event of an emergency, we can acquire additional stock, but would have to report to the commission within a certain frame that we had an emergency and we needed to go and get X, Y, or Z for those emergencies. So there's complete transparency, but also trying to address public safety potential needs. And it could be something similar as, we are out of, flashbangs, or maybe we need to get, some more rifles or whatever the case may be. I can't imagine what it is off the top of my head, but if we need something right away, or it could be chemical munitions, and we need additional chemical munitions for an upcoming event or what have you, that we need to restock rather quickly and then report out on that piece of it.
I think that makes a lot of sense, so that this loophole, this particular exception does not swallow the rule.
Right.
What is a reasonable amount of time for that report out in such a situation?
Joe, do you know what our private requires? I thought it was 30 days, but I could be wrong.
I thought it was a little shorter than that. Let me check on the privacy ordinance while we're talking. I'll get back to you.
So just speaking on behalf of the UAVs, I remember I would do, I think it was like every other month, or if I used it, I would present the following month. They would give me the 30 days. But Joe, you probably have a better timeline, but it was just like a one-page write-up that I would do with a brief synopsis of what happened and why we used it, and just kind of explained what the timeline, whether it was hours or date or whatever it was, and just kind of give a brief synopsis of what happened.
Privacy Commission meets once a month, right?
Yeah, I thought at some point they were meeting twice a month. I could be wrong, or maybe I just attended a lot of meetings. I thought I was going twice a month for about 2 years, but it is that I know of once a month right now.
And this, doing this within an approved amount, is that something that's that y'all find feasible? I mean, we're not talking about increasing the amount that has been approved for that type of equipment, right? Beyond what?
Correct. I think it's just replenishing it. In my mind, I think when I was writing this part of it is, let's say there's a protest or rioting going on for multiple days and we run out of equipment, military equipment, and then we need to get some real fast. So that's why I think this section came to be. But I don't think we'd be going above our amount, and we can definitely add that in there.
And yes, the privacy ordinance is that at the next privacy meeting, which was, it ended up being usually, because they are meeting once a month every 30 days. But yeah, it was the next noticed meeting was when we were required to reply or notice after exigent circumstance use.
We meet twice a month. That may be really fast. So, David, what do you think? In terms of timeline, 30 days, less, more?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little bit torn by this, also distracted by children in my background. But it does seem like a bit of a tight timeline. Or
I don't think we need to come to this decision at the moment. Sorry to
Yeah.
get your pressure. I think it kind of depends on what's going to go into this report or this report out and how available that information is on a very quick basis. Perhaps the department could take a look at what might be in that requirement and give us a sense by the next meeting.
Okay. Okay, moving on. Military equipment use considerations. This is a section that just says it has to be used by our military equipment used by OPD employee after training and required by the post, California Post. Any issues with or concerns?
Are there non-sworn employees using?
No.
Okay. And to the extent that you have, let's say, collaboration between departments, is there ever a situation that you would see a non-OPD employee or sworn, or like say someone from the sheriff's office using OPD technology or equipment?
I mean, only if there might be an emergency, that would be it. And it'd have to be, it'd meet the criteria for like emergencies.
Yeah, that feels like it would reasonably be covered under exigent circumstances under most cases.
Got it.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Lost sound. I think this line, the 1 and 2 language, is pretty similar to the state law where the governing body has to basically certify that these two things are true before approving the information. But there's a third one in the state law, which is that it will, the policy will safeguard public safety, civil liberties. We can find it in there. I don't have it right in front of me, but it seems like it's in the same group of kind of guarantees, if you will, as these two. I can find it if you want.
I can look for it after this and add it. That's probably something good to add. Okay, moving on, military equipment reporting. Upon approval of the military equipment policy, OPD or authorized designee shall submit the military equipment report to the police commission. I mean, I think that's in the OMC too, that we have to go through the police commission. For each type of military equipment approved within 1 year of approval and annually thereafter, as long as we have the equipment. And then we have to make the report public, and then the annual report shall minimum include the following, and it has a bunch of guidelines what that report needs to look like.
Is this the same as the March 15th report?
Yes.
Got it.
What's the turnaround for making a report public usually?
So the typically, if we're going to put something on the agenda packet for the police commission, that's going to be, I think, 72 hours. Is that correct, commissioners? And then, once something, typically the way that I've been approved or putting policies on our websites, once it's been approved by the police commission, and then it will go onto our website. But it will be part of the agenda packet. So even if it's a draft, it will have been in the public agenda packet.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a community engagement section. Within 30 days of submitting a publicly released annual report, the Oakland Police Department through the Police Commission shall hold at least one well-publicized community meeting to talk about the funding, acquisition, and of the military equipment. Okay. Coordination with other jurisdictions, military equipment used by any member of this department shall be approved for use, and in accordance with this policy, military equipment used by other jurisdictions that are not providing mutual aid to the department or otherwise conducting law enforcement activities in this jurisdiction shall comply with their respective military equipment use policies. Maybe that covers that CHP question and people coming into our city.
Yeah, this one we find kind of problematic because it basically means that the policy, when another agency comes in, the policy for use is determined by that agency. So basically any kind of autonomy that Oakland exercises disappears when another agency has a different policy that might be less restrictive. And I can give you a ton of examples, including within Alameda County, of agencies that have not included that second sentence. So are basically saying our policies apply when another agency comes in. And other agencies that have said the respective policies of the visiting agency apply. So there's a mix, but I can give you a lot of examples of law enforcement agencies, city and county, that basically only have that first sentence. Well, actually, not just that first sentence, but basically says anything used within the jurisdiction shall be according to the policies here.
I just don't know how we would police that.
Yeah.
If CHP does a chase into our city, and I mean, I can, make other examples up, but it's like, I don't understand how we govern that.
Because the word here is coordination. If CHP is chasing somebody in here, they're not coordinating.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So anytime coordination, yeah. Because I mean, our mutual aid policy is pretty restrictive and covers a lot of this.
Yeah, I think we harken back to what we found in the section D about collaborating with another law enforcement agency. Sorry to use that word again, but you're working with other agency. You're working with another agency, not a situation where the chase just comes through Oakland, but when there's actually commanding, controlling, or otherwise directing. And in a situation where we are doing that, the mutual aid policy, like you said, is quite restrictive.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems as though the circumstances in which that takes place, that we would be collaborating with another agency. You would be collaborating with another agency in the use of these specific equipments. Is most often, as stated before, a potential, like a SWAT raid, or maybe a protest or something along those lines. In which and it feels like our policy is pretty explicit around that. So it does feel as though this is a little bit of a. It's basically saying we assume that other agency is going to have a policy that meets our community standards, and that we
I could not to cut. I'm sorry to cut you
please,
off, but I could add in, because I was just reviewing one of our ops plans for this upcoming event. We could add in our more restrictive language from our mutual aid, like other departments can't come in and use, what they want. It's just, we don't allow it.
I mean, if I could jump in, I mean, I guess one of the biggest areas that obviously have caused this as a city concern is crowd control. I know I mentioned in past meetings that we are actually under there are two civil suits where we are going to get some injunctions on policy language when it comes to mutual aid, when it comes to crowd control, prohibited munitions, things of that nature for crowd management. There are some areas that, I obviously don't know, even on coordinating. So the primary areas of coordination obviously are crowd control. There could be a tactical operation or SWAT operation where it may, as I mentioned before, hit multiple locations where they'll bring in, outside agencies will bring in, their gas munitions, their militarized rifles, their armored vehicles. Then there are other areas where we would ask specifically for use of a particular equipment, i.e. maybe a ground robot or an aerial vehicle, which certainly has a little bit more controllable nature of it. And then the other area of assistance could be where we are, and this has happened, where we have such a critical incident, all of our resources get shifted to that incident, and we essentially have open beats in the city where we might need to use other agencies to come in and respond to emergency calls. The challenge is some of the more, I guess, critical equipment that could, pose, obviously lethal ramifications, rifles and so forth, would obviously, there are laws governing the use of that equipment. But every agency has their different ways of, say, reporting equipment. How we report, say, use of force is different than another agency that reports the use of force. And I'm kind of getting into those nuances, is having agencies report things that are either by their training they don't do or by their infrastructure they can't do, could be a challenge. I think what we can do is, if those agencies come in a kind of a coordinating effort, is account for how many times they use that equipment. It might not necessarily be used according to how our policies govern it, say, i.e. we have certain ways of rolling out an armored vehicle or the type of armored vehicle they use, but this agency has a different armored vehicle and maybe uses it under a different kind of safety protocol or guidelines. Having them being able to use that equipment in those emergent situations where we need outside help, it could pose a challenge. So I know in looking at, the red book and blue book under mutual aid and how that shakes out, they do fall under incident commander directive of the agency requesting the aid, but how they use or apply force or use certain things within their training and policies, the mutual aid coordination guidance is always giving deference to the agency coming in. So they are deployed by the city that's requesting them, but how they carry out that deployment is usually governed by their policies and their training and tactics. So I don't know how we can get there on other, like I said, emergency issues. Like I said, crowd control is a little different because we do have some prohibited munitions. Certainly the new state law 13652 around use of gas and impact munitions has restricted all agencies within the state of California. And with our court cases that we're going through, I think there'll be a little bit more narrowing of the use of mutual aid when it comes to crowd management. But for some of the more, I guess, serious public safety issues, I think it could be a challenge in getting agencies to follow our use policies compared to their use policies.
So I appreciate the depth of explanation. I'm looking for, and I'll just have to send it subsequent to the meeting perhaps. But there are a lot of examples of other agencies that have addressed this a little differently. So I'll commit to sending that afterwards. I do think that, the thing here is we don't want to open a door to, use that is not in accordance with what the city of Oakland has decided and wants. And understood that sometimes there are unilateral actions, like I think when the eviction of Moms for Housing occurred, that's a sheriff responsibility. And as I understand it, you all can tell me, but the sheriff asked for OPD's collaboration and OPD said no. And perhaps one of the reasons it said no was that it could, the risk was high that the sheriff was going to use equipment in a way that OPD didn't want to work with. That's a different situation than some of the other situations you've talked about. But anyway, I will commit to sending some language after this, and maybe we should just flag it as something to be addressed.
Because I can think of many different solutions to this, right? Especially because we are going to in the future have report outs about the equipment, and which will require commission and council approval. So for instance, one of the things that might be required in some of those report outs or in the controlled equipment impact reports is if the department is intending on collaborating with other agencies to provide as part of the impact report or the annual report or whatever the use policy is, what that other department's military equipment use policy is. Because they will also presumably have created them pursuant to the state law, and then make a decision about whether or not that particular collaboration may or may not be approved or sanctioned at some point, or if there's a preference for jurisdiction that may occur. We have the benefit of, at the very least, knowing that almost every single agency up and down the state, every single agency up and down the state is going to be making equipment use policies for all of these things. So we will know exactly what their procedures are. So there could be workarounds.
And actually, Commissioner Shea, I think that is, I think a good kind of direction to flow in. One of the nuanced examples, some of the equipment that can be nuanced, and for example, with firearms, our policy is we pretty much capture as much as we can when it comes to use of force. We have to have our officers annotate when they draw their firearms, but say they don't point it at an individual. But if we do point a firearm at an individual, whether it's intentional or non-intentional, we report it as use of force. Not every agency does that. So you can imagine if we have agencies coming in and they point their firearm, or maybe they don't point their firearm, but they draw it, but they report it differently. It could be, those little details could be very difficult to have other agencies try and comport with the way we report force. So it's just that's just one example of many different types of force reporting. Another one is SIMs, or especially impact munitions. We require if you point 37 or 40 millimeter impact munition at an individual, even if you don't deploy an impact munition as a reportable use of force. Not every agency does that. In fact, I don't know if many agencies actually do that. And so to have them comport, they may say, well, we don't have a mechanism to report that. We don't have a vision system or a use of force report that allows us to report it that way. So one of the things about being a very progressive agency that has a lot of restrictive policies that are, for public trust and transparency, not everybody is in the Bay Area as progressive as the city of Oakland Local Police Department. So it becomes kind of, again, difficult to try and marry those up. But I like the idea of where you're going with, well, maybe when we bring in other agencies, we at least at minimum acquire their use policies. So when we report out on it, we have their policies and how they do deploy and report their equipment.
I think that another sort of aspect of what John was speaking about, John Lindsay Poland was speaking about, I am curious to see what those other jurisdictions are what language they're using. But I think it's also important to sort of note that whether those comparisons are truly apples to apples, I think it has probably a lot to do with what that particular agency's resources available are, and how likely they may be to engage in mutual aid of that type. what their relationship with other agencies in their vicinity may be. I think there's a lot of sort of nuance to why or why not an agency may choose to perceive want to have a more restrictive language around equipment usage during mutual aid. And so I think that seeing the language is one thing, but I think also sort of having a greater understanding of what those relationships look like is also potentially helpful. I know that that's probably more data than maybe you can bring to bear for us, but it would be helpful to sort of see that, because our relationship with the sheriff's department and the CHP has been especially recently somewhat fraught, and that may not be the same as what other jurisdictions are dealing with, because as the chief said, we are attempting to have a much more sort of progressive policing environment here, and that is not always the case for some of our neighbors, at least in the past. I do think that the inclusion of at least understanding, because it says here, if we're saying that they comply with their respective military equipment use policies, that that by the very nature that we should be requesting those, and that should be that piece of it should be very transparent as well, as Commissioner Shea was suggesting. It looks like John has his hand up.
Yeah, I having looked at a lot of military equipment policies and the underlying equipment policies in a lot of departments, the permutations get pretty crazy. But the conversation is raising two questions for me. One is actually a process question for tonight. I think we're scheduled until 8, although I'm not sure. And I just want to ask if, before we adjourn, if we could come to some agreement about what documents we'll focus on in the next meeting, because we'll probably take a much closer read of those before that, so that we're best prepared as we can be. And the other question is actually substantive here, and that is, Chief, your discussion of use of force reminds me that sometimes agencies think about use pretty much only in terms of use of force. Like when they're thinking about reporting, they're thinking about reporting uses of force. And the state law, and I don't think that the ordinance really defines use very closely. I think the assumption is that it's broader than use of force. And so the question is, going back up to the F reporting section, whether use, how y'all are thinking about use, particularly in 2A, a summary of how the equipment was used. Because if it's only uses of force, then you're going to have a ton of armored vehicle deployments that might not, qualify. But I think they would be the intention was that, when they're deployed somewhere, that they are being used, and that would be reportable. So I just want, it's not an ambiguity that the department created, but I am wondering what y'all are thinking about.
Yeah, and forgive me, when I try to give the example of the firearm use of force, it was just for the particular that particular nuance, but certainly a deployment would be considered a use. So every time we utilize the armored vehicle, we report out on it, regardless of whether or not there was an incident that had a use of force. If we use the armored vehicle, or if we use the UAV for its intended purpose, it would be reportable. It wouldn't just be linked to a use of force.
And for the less lethals and the rifles,
so it would be, yeah, so it would be deployment. So for example, our rifles, we use deployment logs. So anytime a patrol rifle officer retrieves their rifle to deploy on a scene, say a yard search, but for example, maybe they do a yard search and the individual is not located, we would still track the use of that rifle. It would not be just subject to a use of force.
Okay. It might be useful to put some language of what you just said in here somewhere.
It would be
So-
for us, I think, where we were intending on making sure it was in the use policy for that particular equipment. Because obviously each equipment's a little nuanced differently, you know, obviously the use of rifles and how we capture that's going to be different than the use of UAVs. And so the singular uses of each equipment would be tied to that particular equipment and its own policy.
I see. Okay. And in terms of our agenda for the next, I don't know when we're adjourning tonight, or if we can, just before we adjourn, if we can decide that what we're doing next time.
Yeah, roughly how far into this document are we?
We're on page 9 of, and there's really only 10. The page 11 is the signature page. So we're
Okay.
pretty much almost done.
So let's see if we can get through this, and then once this is done, and barring any sort of large controversy, hopefully we'll have 5 minutes or so to discuss next steps and what we're going to review next time.
Next section is going to be the complaint process, and that's taken from the government code. And then we talk about M3, which is the Department General Order, complaints against department personnel. And then we have, we're going to create a email address to where people can have questions or make complaints. And then also we have the address in here to make it easy.
We're gonna need to add a check email to the duties above.
Yeah.
Is there a very quick way for anybody who's reading this policy or any other policy to know how they can make complaints without having to refer to DGO M3?
I think it's just right in here, just by email or by mail.
Well, this is going to be inquiries, not the complaints.
Yeah.
So my question was whether
Just to make
complaint-
put in internal affairs number and stuff, and
Yeah.
maybe the police. Yeah.
Best doing that is just adding, maybe we can take it right out of the handouts we give.
Yeah.
Field for complaints. We could just, almost copy, because I definitely don't want to have language conflict with a complaint process. So maybe that complaint form, we just kind of copy and paste, how to make a complaint and put it right in there for consistency. And you can include the CPRA piece of it as well as the IA piece of it.
Yeah, or add those as appendixes to each one.
I didn't understand what you said before, but now I get it. So yeah, absolutely.
Shouldn't CPRA be in here too?
That will be in there. It'll be both. It'll be right underneath right here. I'll add it in.
Do you mean as part of this policy or part of this ad hoc? Mr. Lindsay Poland.
Both. That violations, I would think, should be reportable, or complaints should be reportable to the CPRA.
There will be a section about it. I think they were just talking about it, both the handout for internal affairs and CPRA. And then the second is not yet.
And so this section right here is just inquiries. So if people want to have questions, they can email or mail to the police department. And then general questions or concerns can be routed to the military equipment coordinator. Okay, audit and oversight. So we got the government code 7072, which we have to have the results of an internal audit. And then just, and the OMC talks about auditing and oversight. And then the Oakland Police Department Office of Internal Accountability will conduct a yearly audit, internal audit, and providing information on violations of this policy. This report will be added to the yearly report. And then I think that we made the commission the independent entity of oversight authority. And the OIG will conduct audits to ensure compliance. I did add this in today, so that's why it's kind of incomplete, but we have a reporting mechanism here. And this is for when any of the deemed military equipment is used, how are they going to report it? Like right now, and I heard the chief say that maybe we'll do it in each policy, or we can have it here in this policy. I can take this out if we want to just do it in each individual policy, have that reporting mechanism, or have each commander or authorized in the military use, have them do the after action report.
You know what, Jeff, we might have a sort of catch-all like this one for if we don't have it specifically in the policy. This is useful for sort of low frequency events, but then something like, you know, PROs or whatever, it's going to be maddening for the watch commander to have to say, okay, did I authorize the use of the rifle on, you know, these 5 different scenes? So I think we'll probably look at if it makes sense in the report, in the use policy, to have that reporting like a specific call out, and then otherwise, you know, we can reference back to this general thing to catch if we don't have, you know, for things that are a little more low incidence.
Right, and I just wanted to add just the after action reporting piece of it. Certainly that is our after action requirements are fairly involved. And so for the low frequency things, I think to Lieutenant Turner's point, that's exactly right. We can get an after action because a lot of the times it's connected to an operation. On some of the other more frequent, having to do an after action, every single use could be problematic. So I think we have to figure out how we want to capture it, where we want to capture it, and say the minimum captured of information is X, Y, or Z, you know, whether it's an email to you or to a system that we devised to capture it. And then in the specific equipment, you know, whether it's the armored vehicle or chemical munitions, you know, that it makes sense to write an after action. I think that would be in the specific policy that addresses it.
Appreciate that. Does this section get this information to the military equipment coordinator?
Yes.
That's included in the OPD command email?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, and then the L section is just the military equipment inventory. So it just says the attachment is the military list, which was, hopefully you guys have it, that's on our website, the 34-page list.
All right, so as far as next steps, oh, go ahead.
I just have a question about that last sentence. So it's either commercially available or military equipment modified for law enforcement uses. Can you give me an example of military equipment that's been modified for law enforcement uses that is not commercially available? Like, would the Bearcat qualify for that? Because it's the Bearcat is purchased, you know, so I don't.
You know, I think this section foresees a possibility, but I don't think that currently the department owns any material that is not commercially available.
Does it cover a situation where you end up with like a retired military piece of equipment or equipment from the military and you get it, but not like it's not purchased, you know?
I think that's what it's trying to cover. You know, we have certain, like, we don't find a use for much of that type of stuff, which is why we don't participate like in those programs where we're getting this sort of surplus equipment, because most of the time it's just not useful for civilian law enforcement. There is a possibility, you know, the military, as it transitions or as you see a lot of policing missions, they do use some of these things. If, you know, it's something that's commercially available, the military buys it and then they decommission it, and we were able to get it at a really good deal, I could see us doing that, and then, you know, removing militarized equipment such as like, you know, mounted weapons or things like that. So I think it allows for that, but that currently we don't have any of those things.
Seems like since this refers to the current inventory, that phrase might be struck.
Yeah, I think it might get taken out.
Assuming it's true. I want it to be
Yeah.
true.
It is. We don't have equipment that we got from the United States.
Yeah, we don't.
We're good.
Here's another question. Since this is a policy that's going to last a number of years, are you going to continue updating Appendix A?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
That as we, you know, get approval to purchase more equipment, you know, say we need a 4th command post or, you know, 3rd armored vehicle or whatever, and we get authorization for those purchases to this body, then certainly we wouldn't want to come back and change the policy every single time, but just update the inventory list that we refer to.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And the whole thing does have to come back to the commission and the council every year anyway, so.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So as we take a few minutes to wrap up and to sort of consider next steps, I think now that we've gone through this policy once and heard sort of where each of these sections comes from, I think it might behoove us to go through it one more time between meetings, especially those that are not working with it on a day-to-day basis, and think about if there's anything else that may come up. We'll probably take part of the meeting next time to sort of think about and see some of the changes that are brought up or are made. And does it make sense to try to tackle one of the other policies at this next meeting to keep the momentum going? And if so, which one? Does it make sense to do the UAV or UAS system, since it's one that's gone through a commission already?
I was actually, I mean, if could, I would offer that up. 2 things. One, maybe we can get a track change version of the modifications of K7 we just talked about tonight. That way you have a real edited version. We can go back through it again in the next meeting. And then certainly it would be good to go over the UAV policy, since I know it went through Privacy Commission, and so it'd be good to get that back around to this commission so we can move it forward to council. And I was wondering, because I know this body's approved the armored vehicle policy, but it never really got approved by council, which is obviously an approval step. We got to meet for the legal requirements. So I don't know if that's something we could suggest to either send to the next commission meeting for vote to move it forward, or how procedurally you best think we can move that. But I think those are 3 things that we could tackle in the next meeting.
Yeah,
One thing to note is that the armored vehicle policy has, I think, most of the substantive things that are required by the ordinance and by AB 41, but there are a few other points that that legislation requires that are not in the armored vehicle policy. I don't think it's going to be hard. I think the hardest stuff was done in putting together that policy, but there is further action that's required. It's just mostly information that has to be in the use policy for those things. Just to note that.
Is it too much of an ask for the department and Mr. Lindsay Pullen to go through the 2 policies that we just mentioned, the unmanned aerial system and the
armored vehicle.
Thank you, armored vehicle, and just make suggestions or have a draft of what that updated policy looks like for the next meeting in 2 weeks, so that rather than sort of figuring out what needs to be updated, we just have a proposed updated draft? Those are just low-hanging fruit that I think we can sort of get in this practice of doing it, since it's just updating to meet state and local law.
Yes, from the department's perspective, yeah, we can absolutely do that.
What I can say is that for for the UA, for the drones, it's something I've worked a lot less on. And I would lean on the Privacy Commission folks and you all to understand that better. So it's much easier for me with the armored vehicle stuff and the red line thing of what we just looked at. That's going to be easier than the drone stuff. It's a deeper dive.
Okay. Why don't we give it a shot and then see where we end up with, if we need to take additional meetings or community or input or bring in other people as well, we can do that. But let's try to give it a shot and keep things moving, keep a good pace. Does that sound okay? Great. Well, sorry to all make you meet on Juneteenth and not a state holiday, but city and county.
And
holiday.
the next one is scheduled for July 4th, which is also a holiday.
Ooh, yeah, can we push that to
By the
July?
way,
Oh,
Oh, yeah, all right.
In the city of Oakland.
Let's see here. Let's
Yeah.
see if we can
I'll
do
be here.
something about that. I will also
I won't be
probably-
here, but my colleague Jennifer too, who has also been requested to be on there, she will. But maybe other people don't want to be on the 4th.
David, well, I think my Tuesday is clear, July 5th. How about you?
1 second.
Yeah, because I have body worn camera on the alternating weeks.
If we're gonna be doing the UAB, I'm not available on the 5th. I mean, doing I think I have another commitment that day already, just FYI. Unless if we're gonna do it, that's gonna maybe be 30 minutes, I have no problem, but if it's gonna be 2 hours, I don't think I'll be able to attend.
Is there a part of the evening that's better or worse for you?
Maybe before 5 o'clock on that day is fine. I think we're just doing a get together here, so.
Well, since we start at 6, that probably won't work out too well. Okay, well.
Could we do an hour on the 27th and an hour on the 5th?
Commissioner Shea and I have a alternate ad hoc that we work on the other Mondays that we're not doing this. So Mondays somehow is one of the only days of the week that is good for both of us. So it is challenging to try and fit that in. Maybe we just maybe we prioritize reviewing the overarching military use policy and the armored vehicle policy in our next meeting on the 5th, and push the drones out to the following 2 weeks out to what, the 18th? No, sorry, the 18th.
Well, let's still bring the policy on the 5th. We won't talk about the policy substantively. I just want to see I want to see the updates to the that make it compliant with state and local law, and then also talk about it the following week for substantive, if there is any. Does that work okay? So that we can keep work going?
If we start at 6, I have no problem jumping in. I'm going to the A's game. I'll be honest. I already bought these tickets. Just getting it out there.
You should go to the A's game. So we could start at 6 with
Perfect.
the UAV
Yeah.
policy, and then we'll get that. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, cool.
Works for me.
Can't hate against supporting Oakland. So, okay. Well, I think that's it. Next meeting is going to be July 5th. We'll modify the Zoom invite so everyone has them. Thank you all so much. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your collaboration. Keep at it.
Good night.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night.
Thank you.
Right.